Welcome to another episode of True Crime Story Vault. Today's episode takes us to the quiet coastal town of Carrington, Maine, where a shocking crime shattered the peace of this tight-knit community. This is the story of ambition, jealousy, and ultimate betrayal, unraveling between three friends whose lives intertwined in a way no one could have predicted. What started as a professional partnership blossomed into a dark obsession and eventually murder. Prepare yourself for the emotional turmoil and brutal betrayal of this disturbing tale. In the autumn of 2019, the coastal town of Carrington seemed to be the embodiment of tranquility, a place where the wind carried the salty tang of the sea and life moved at a leisurely pace. The people were content with their simple routines, and even the tourists who occasionally flocked to its sandy shores found the town's charm to be in its unchanging, predictable nature. It was the sort of place where time seemed to slow down, and nothing, it appeared, could ever truly disturb its calm. Emily Sutherland, 32, was one of Carrington's brightest stars. A successful architect, she had built a reputation for herself not only through her talent, but through her ability to breathe new life into the town's aesthetic. Her designs, a blend of modern sleekness and coastal charm, seemed to capture the spirit of Carrington itself, timeless yet forward-looking. Emily's work on community projects had earned her a glowing reputation, and she was seen as the embodiment of success in this peaceful, rustic town. She led a life that others admired. Her relationship with her fiancé, Thomas Bennett, was the subject of envy. Thomas, 35, was a real estate agent whose charisma matched Emily's ambition. Together, they were seen as the perfect couple, driven, successful, and deeply in love. They had been together for 6 years, and as their wedding date inched closer, it seemed like their future was set in stone. Thomas was known for his smooth charm, his ability to sell even the most unremarkable property, and his deep devotion to Emily. Their relationship was not without its flaws. There were occasional arguments, typical disagreements about the stress of wedding planning, but nothing that seemed to threaten the core of what they had built. Thomas was proud of Emily's accomplishments, always boasting about her work to anyone who would listen. But amid the outward perfection, there was another figure who would soon become central to the story: David Caldwell. David was new to Carrington, having moved there from Boston just a few months earlier. At 30, he was a software engineer who had grown tired of the relentless pace of city life. He had come to Carrington seeking solace, a fresh start where he could work remotely and breathe in the serenity of a small town. It was through a professional project that David and Emily's paths first crossed. Emily was overseeing the design of a set of upscale homes along the coast, and David had been hired to implement smart home technology in the properties. Their collaboration started off purely professional, but as time went on, they found common ground, not just in their work but in their personalities. David was captivated by Emily, her drive, her creativity, and the way she seemed to command a room without trying. She, on the other hand, admired David's quiet intelligence and his refreshing humility, something she didn't often find in the ambitious world of real estate and architecture. At first, David was content just to be part of Emily's world. He didn't see himself as a threat to her relationship with Thomas, nor did he want to be. He respected her, valued her friendship, and genuinely believed that his feelings for her were nothing more than admiration. But as the weeks turned into months, something shifted inside him. Emily, always gracious and warm, treated David with kindness and attention that he had rarely experienced before. It wasn't that she treated him differently than anyone else. Emily was kind to everyone but to David. Her attention felt unique, special. The trio soon became inseparable. Thomas, with his easygoing nature, welcomed David into their social circle. They often spent weekends together, exploring the coast or having dinners at Emily and Thomas's home. To an outsider, it would have looked like the perfect friendship: three young professionals, bound by mutual respect and camaraderie. But beneath the surface, tension was brewing. David's admiration for Emily was slowly turning into something more, something darker. He found himself thinking about her constantly, replaying their conversations in his mind, analyzing every glance, every smile. His rational mind told him that Emily was in love with Thomas, that she would never see him as anything more than a friend. But a small, insidious voice inside him whispered otherwise. That voice grew louder as the days passed. It didn't help that Emily, engrossed in wedding planning, was beginning to show signs of stress. She confided in David more often than she did in Thomas, sharing her anxieties about the big day, about the pressures of balancing her work and her personal life. David, ever the good listener, soaked it all in, offering her support without judgment. "You know, sometimes I wonder if we're rushing into this," Emily admitted one evening as they sat on the back porch of her home, watching the sunset over the ocean. "Thomas is great, but the wedding, it's all becoming too much." David's heart raced at her words. He had been waiting for an opening, something that might suggest Emily wasn't as sure about Thomas as she seemed. He kept his voice calm, though inside he was anything but. "Maybe it's not about the wedding itself," he said carefully. "Maybe it's about the pressure that comes with it. Have you talked to Thomas about how you're feeling?" Emily sighed, leaning back in her chair. "He doesn't really get it. He's all about keeping things moving forward, making decisions, pushing ahead. I don't know. Sometimes it feels like he's more excited about the idea of being married than actually being married to me." David's pulse quickened. This was what he had been waiting to hear, confirmation that Emily had doubts. His mind raced, formulating the perfect response, something that would keep him in her good graces while planting the seeds of uncertainty about Thomas. "You deserve someone who listens to you, Emily. Someone who really understands what you need." Emily smiled weakly, not fully grasping the weight of his words. "I know. I just need to figure things out." As Emily returned to the whirlwind of wedding planning, David's feelings intensified. He started showing up at her office unexpectedly, offering to help with errands, finding any excuse to be near her. Thomas, busy with his own work, didn't notice the change in David's behavior, but Emily did. She began to sense that something was off, though she couldn't quite put her finger on it. One evening, after a particularly stressful day, Emily found herself venting to David once again. She was overwhelmed by the demands of both her career and the wedding, and Thomas, who had always been her rock, seemed distant. David listened intently, his eyes never leaving her face. "You don't have to go through this alone, you know," he said softly. "I'm here for you. I'll always be here for you." Emily smiled, but there was an uneasiness in her chest. David's words, his tone, there was something in them that unsettled her. It was as though a boundary had been crossed, but she couldn't quite define what that boundary was. She pushed the thought aside, chalking it up to her own stress and exhaustion. As the wedding drew nearer, David's obsession grew. He began to convince himself that Emily was trapped, that she didn't truly love Thomas but was too afraid to break off the engagement. He became more possessive, more insistent that she needed to reconsider her decision. He dropped hints, small suggestions that maybe she was making a mistake. But Emily, for all her doubts, still loved Thomas. She couldn't imagine her life without him, and despite her conversations with David, she remained committed to the wedding. She started to pull back from David, sensing that his presence in her life was becoming overwhelming. She canceled plans, avoided his calls, and spent more time with Thomas, trying to refocus on their relationship. David, however, didn't take the distance well. He became more erratic, his texts to Emily growing more frequent, his tone more desperate. He showed up at her office late one night, unannounced and clearly agitated. "We need to talk," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I can't keep pretending anymore." "David, it's late," Emily replied, feeling a knot of anxiety form in her stomach. "I don't know what you mean." "I love you, Emily. I can't watch you marry him. I've tried to be patient, to wait for you to see it, but I can't do this anymore." Emily's heart dropped. She had sensed David's feelings were more than friendship, but hearing the words out loud was like a punch to the gut. She stood frozen, unsure of how to respond. David, I don't feel that way. I'm with Thomas. We're getting married." David's face twisted, his calm demeanor evaporating. "You're making a mistake. He doesn't love you the way I do. He doesn't understand you. You're just afraid to admit it." Emily backed away, panic rising in her chest. "I think you should leave." David stood there for a moment, his eyes wild with desperation. But then, just as quickly, he turned and stormed out of the office, leaving Emily shaken and terrified of what might come next. The winter of 2020 brought a chilling edge to the usually serene town of Carrington. Snowfall blanketed the streets, transforming the town into a picturesque winter wonderland. But beneath this veneer of beauty, a storm was brewing. The frost-covered rooftops and icy sidewalks mirrored the growing coldness in the lives of its residents, particularly among Emily Sutherland, Thomas Bennett, and David Caldwell. David's transformation was nothing short of alarming. The amiable and reserved software engineer who had first arrived in Carrington seemed to have been replaced by a man whose demeanor was increasingly erratic and unsettling. His initial reserved charm had deteriorated into an obsessive intensity. It was subtle at first, small, uncharacteristic actions that might have been dismissed as mere quirks. He began making veiled comments about Emily and Thomas's relationship. "You know, Emily," he would say casually, "Thomas seems a bit distracted lately. Do you think he's as invested in this as you are?" Emily, caught off guard by the comment, would usually shrug it off with a forced smile. She and Thomas had been navigating the stress of wedding planning, and it wasn't uncommon for them to clash over minor details. Emily had attributed their recent arguments to the typical pressures of organizing a wedding and the strain that came with it. Despite the tension between them, she was determined to push through, believing that the love they shared would see them through. Yet David's behavior began to cross boundaries. He began showing up at Emily's office unannounced, under the guise of checking on a project or offering assistance. His visits grew more frequent, and his presence started to feel intrusive rather than helpful. He would linger in her workspace, his eyes trailing her every move with an unsettling gaze. The phone calls came next. David's calls were often late at night, his voice strained and full of a desperation that Emily found increasingly unsettling. He would inquire about her well-being, sometimes even asking if she was happy with Thomas. His questions, once framed as concern, began to take on a more possessive tone. One particularly frigid February evening, after a heated argument with Thomas about wedding arrangements, a dispute that had left Emily feeling both emotionally drained and conflicted, she decided to meet David for drinks at a local bar. The bar was dimly lit, with a warm ambience that felt like a temporary escape from the biting cold outside. Emily sank into a booth, nursing a cocktail as David joined her, his expression unreadable. The conversation started innocuously enough. David listened as Emily recounted the day's frustrations, his face a mask of concern. But as the evening wore on, David's demeanor changed. He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a low, almost conspiratorial whisper. "Sometimes I feel like we're just going through the motions," Emily said, her voice tinged with sadness as she stirred her drink absent-mindedly. "I love him, but I don't know if this is what I really want." David's eyes were fixed on her with an intensity that made Emily uncomfortable. "You deserve more than this, Emily. You deserve someone who truly sees you, who understands your worth. Thomas, he's not the right person for you." Emily chuckled nervously, trying to dismiss David's comment as a result of the alcohol. "You sound jealous, David. I'm sure it's just wedding stress." But David's reaction was anything but light-hearted. His eyes darkened, and he leaned in closer, his breath warm against her face. "If only you knew," he whispered, his voice laced with an edge of fervor that sent a shiver down Emily's spine. The conversation ended abruptly. Emily attempted to brush off David's words, attributing them to the combination of stress and alcohol. Yet, a lingering sense of discomfort clung to her as she left the bar. The unsettling feeling that something had shifted between them was hard to shake. Days turned into weeks, and the tension only intensified. David's behavior continued to spiral. He would call Emily at odd hours, sometimes claiming to be worried about her safety, other times insisting that they meet to discuss something urgent. His messages became more frequent, their tone increasingly desperate and accusatory. Emily tried to distance herself, but David's persistence made it difficult. She found herself avoiding places where she knew David might appear, and her interactions with Thomas became strained. The constant presence of David's unsettling behavior loomed over her, creating a rift in her relationship with Thomas. The wedding, once a symbol of their future, now felt like a looming pressure that Emily struggled to escape. One night, Emily found herself at home, sitting in the dim glow of her living room, the silence of the house oppressive. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the door. She opened it to find David standing there, his face a mask of urgency and determination. "Emily, we need to talk," he said, his voice carrying an undertone of desperation. "I've told you before, David, I need some space," Emily replied, her voice firm but tinged with worry. David's eyes widened with an intensity that was both unsettling and frightening. "It's important. Please, just listen to me." Against her better judgment, Emily allowed him inside. They sat down in her living room, and David began speaking in a hurried, almost frantic manner. He talked about how he couldn't stand to see her with someone who didn't appreciate her fully, how he believed that she was making a grave mistake by marrying Thomas. Emily tried to remain calm, but the conversation only heightened her anxiety. "David, you're overstepping. I appreciate your concern, but my relationship with Thomas is my own. I need you to respect that." David's face twisted into a grimace of frustration. "You don't understand. I've done everything I can to be supportive, but it's not enough. You need to see that Thomas is not the right person for you." As the conversation continued, it became increasingly clear that David's fixation on Emily was growing more dangerous. His declarations of love, combined with his increasing hostility toward Thomas, painted a disturbing picture of a man who had lost touch with reality. Emily's unease reached its peak as she watched David leave, his eyes reflecting a manic determination that left her shaken. The remainder of the winter was filled with a growing sense of dread. Emily's interactions with David became fraught with tension, and her attempts to distance herself seemed only to fuel his obsession. The once idyllic life she had known was unraveling, and the snow-covered town of Carrington was no longer a haven, but a backdrop to a deepening crisis. As the frost of winter began to thaw and the first hints of spring emerged in Carrington, the tranquil veneer of the town was disrupted by growing tensions among its residents. Emily Sutherland found herself increasingly unsettled by David Caldwell's increasingly erratic behavior, while the town itself seemed to be waking up from its winter slumber. The turmoil in Emily's personal life was reaching a fever pitch. David, who had once been the picture of calm and reserved demeanor, was now a source of constant anxiety for Emily. His interactions with her became fraught with an underlying tension, particularly when Thomas Bennett was around. David's agitation was palpable, his comments became sharper, and his presence more intrusive. Emily noticed subtle shifts in his behavior, the way he would clench his fists when Thomas was mentioned, or how his voice would take on a sharper edge whenever he spoke about Thomas. Thomas, for his part, had begun to sense something was off. He was increasingly vocal about his concerns regarding Emily's friendship with David. He questioned why David seemed to be around so often, and why Emily seemed to confide in him more than in him. Thomas's concerns were met with defensiveness from Emily, who insisted that David was simply a friend and nothing more. Still, the cracks in their relationship were becoming more apparent, as arguments about David and his role in their lives became frequent. One evening in late April, Emily was out at a community meeting, leaving Thomas alone in their home. With a sense of unease gnawing at him, Thomas decided to look through some papers on Emily's desk. What he found would alter the course of their lives. Among the scattered documents and unopened mail, Thomas stumbled upon a series of emails between Emily and David. Most of the correspondence was related to their joint work on the smart home project. But there was one email that stood out, a message that was both personal and disturbing. Dated just a few weeks prior, it read, "I know you don't feel the same way about me, but I can't just stand by and watch you marry him. You're making a mistake, Emily. I can be everything you need. I can give you the life you deserve." Thomas's hands trembled as he absorbed the weight of the email. His heart raced, and a cold realization settled over him. David was harboring feelings for Emily, feelings for Emily that were not just unrequited but dangerously obsessive. The calm exterior that David had maintained now seemed like a facade in a deep, possessive love. Anger flared within Thomas, mingling with a sense of betrayal. He felt a surge of panic, realizing that the man he had considered a friend was actually a threat to his future with Emily. Determined to confront the situation head-on, Thomas decided to seek out David directly. The confrontation could no longer be delayed. He needed answers, and he needed them now. Later that night, Thomas found David outside his apartment, pacing back and forth in the dim light of the street. The night air was crisp, and the quiet of the deserted street was occasionally broken by the distant sounds of the city. David's agitation was visible, his movements sharp and erratic. Without hesitation, Thomas approached him, his face set in a grim expression of resolve. Thomas's anger was immediate and raw. He grabbed David by the collar and slammed him against the wall of the apartment building. The sudden violence took David by surprise, and for a moment, the two men were locked in a tense standoff. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Thomas hissed through gritted teeth, his voice a low growl of fury. "You think I don't know about you and Emily?" David's response was a chilling smirk that seemed out of place in the tense moment. His eyes gleamed with a strange light, reflecting the dim street light. "You don't know anything, Thomas. You can't stop what's going to happen." Thomas's mind raced, struggling to process David's cryptic words. "What are you talking about?" he demanded, his grip on David's collar tightening. David met Thomas's gaze with a calmness that was both unsettling and defiant. "I love her more than you ever could," David said, his voice barely more than a whisper but laden with a fervent intensity. The declaration hit Thomas like a punch to the gut. He could see the depth of David's obsession, the way it consumed him, and the realization dawned that David was not just a friend but a dangerous force that threatened everything Thomas had built with Emily. David's cold, detached demeanor only heightened Thomas's sense of dread. The situation had escalated far beyond a simple disagreement or jealousy. There was something darker at play, a fixation that could unravel everything. Thomas released David, his mind racing as he stepped back. David, seemingly unaffected by the physical confrontation, straightened his clothing and looked at Thomas with a mix of pity and disdain. The confrontation had revealed the depth of David's obsession but had not resolved the underlying conflict. As Thomas walked away, his thoughts were consumed by the chilling implications of David's obsession. He knew that confronting Emily with this revelation would be difficult and could potentially push her further away. Yet, he also knew that ignoring David's threat was not an option. The safety of his relationship with Emily, and perhaps even Emily herself, depended on taking decisive action. The tension between the three friends was now reaching a breaking point, and as spring continued to unfold, the storm that had been brewing was about to explode. The idyllic facade of Carrington was about to be shattered, and the consequences of David's obsessive love were about to become painfully clear. The wedding day dawned clear and bright in June, casting a golden hue over the quaint town of Carrington. The skies were a brilliant blue, unmarred by clouds, and the air was filled with the fragrant scent of blooming flowers. It was the kind of perfect day that dreams are made of, a picturesque backdrop for what was meant to be one of the happiest moments of Emily Sutherland and Thomas Bennett's lives. The guests, dressed in their finest attire, filled the pews of the town's charming church. The atmosphere was charged with excitement and anticipation as friends and family gathered to witness the union of the beloved couple. The church, with its ivy-clad walls and stained glass windows, had been meticulously decorated for the occasion. White roses and lilies adorned the aisles, and soft, classical music played in the background, adding to the serene and joyous ambience. But as the clock ticked closer to the ceremony start time, an unsettling undercurrent began to ripple through the crowd. Emily, the radiant bride who had been the center of attention all day, was nowhere to be seen. Her absence was initially attributed to last-minute preparations or a minor delay, but as the minutes stretched into a tense silence, an uneasy feeling settled over the guests. Whispers began to circulate, and concern etched itself into the faces of those waiting eagerly for the ceremony to begin. Thomas Bennett, standing at the altar in his impeccably tailored suit, paced back and forth. His usual composure was replaced by a look of deepening worry. His mind raced, trying to come up with a plausible explanation for Emily's delay. He could feel a gnawing sense of dread in the pit of his stomach, an intuition that something was terribly wrong. Without warning, a piercing scream shattered the calm. The mournful cry echoed through the church, causing a collective gasp of horror from the guests. Panic erupted as people rushed outside, driven by the desperate need to understand the source of the scream. What they found was a scene of unimaginable horror. Near the garden, under the shadow of an ancient oak tree, lay Emily's lifeless body. Her white wedding dress, once symbolizing purity and joy, was now stained with blood. The sight was so shocking that many of the guests staggered back in disbelief. David Caldwell, the man who had been a close friend and collaborator, stood over her with a knife in hand. The blade, slick with blood, glistened menacingly in the sunlight. David's face was a mask of derangement, his eyes wild and unseeing. His clothing was smeared with the blood of the woman he had once professed to care for deeply. He stood there, frozen in his madness, as the crowd gathered in stunned silence. "I did it for you," David screamed, his voice cracking with a frenzied intensity. "I did it because I love you, Emily. I couldn't stand to see you make a mistake." The police arrived within minutes, but the tragedy was already complete. Emily was declared dead at the scene, her life brutally ended by the actions of a man who had been consumed by a twisted obsession. David was promptly arrested, his incoherent ramblings providing little solace or clarity to the grieving onlookers. The investigation that followed was swift but no less harrowing. David's defense in court was a grotesque attempt to justify his actions. He claimed that he had acted out of love, that his crime was a misguided attempt to save Emily from what he perceived as a dreadful mistake. The defense argued that David's actions, however horrific, were driven by an intense, albeit warped, emotional attachment. The prosecution, however, painted a starkly different picture. They depicted David as a man whose obsession with Emily had morphed into a deadly fixation. Evidence of David's disturbing behavior leading up to the wedding was presented, including the incriminating emails and witness testimonies about his increasingly erratic actions. The jury saw through David's delusions, understanding that his claims of love were nothing more than a grotesque excuse for his heinous crime. The trial concluded with David being sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. His fate was sealed, but the damage he had inflicted could not be undone. The courtroom, filled with the somber faces of Emily's friends and family, echoed with the finality of justice being served. Yet it could not bring back the vibrant life that had been so senselessly cut short. Thomas, shattered by the loss of Emily and the betrayal of a friend he had trusted, struggled to come to terms with the Comstock. The town of Carrington, once known for its peaceful charm, was left reeling from the shocking events. The idyllic community was forever marked by the brutal murder, a dark stain on its otherwise serene history. As the days turned into weeks, Thomas chose to leave Carrington. The town, now a constant reminder of his greatest heartbreak, was a place he could no longer bear to inhabit. He sought solace in a fresh start away from the memories that haunted him. The tragic love triangle that had begun with friendship and promise ended in bloodshed and devastation. Emily's dreams, Thomas's hopes, and David's twisted affection converged in a moment of unimaginable violence. The story of their lives serves as a haunting reminder that unchecked obsession can lead to darkness far beyond what anyone could have foreseen. In the quiet streets of Carrington, the echoes of that fateful day lingered, a somber testament to the fragility of happiness and the depths of human despair.